So this is the talk how everything in general sucks. In the next track, there's a talk about how being told that you suck is valuable. So the individual track is next door. I actually wanted to chicken out of this talk title and change it, but the conference insisted on keeping it. So thank you for that. The alternative title is Old Man Yells at Cloud Evangelists. So who am I? I'm Florian Gilcher. I have problems pronouncing my surname in English as well, so this sound really doesn't fit the English flow. You can find me on Twitter as Agrak, on GitHub as Skade. I have these two companies, Ascara and Ferris Systems. Ascara doing more Ruby work and infrastructure work, Ferris Systems being completely based on my current love project, Rust. I do manage free and open source projects. I used to be part of the Padrino web framework project, and which was a competitor to Rails, and now I'm in leadership with Rust. I do community management and moderation, event organizing, and I'm a Mozilla Tech speaker. First of all, community is a massively overloaded term. So at some point you will be like, this is not my community term that he's using. Probably I'll be the same. Also, community has become a marketing trope, and this is basically what this talk is about. And it's a talk about bitter pills to avoid you swallowing them. It's not that I want you to swallow them. I have run a number of conferences over the last almost 10 years, 15 or so, two Ruby conferences and the European Rust conference called RustFest, and another one where I'm actually doing commercial conference management, which is called the Oxidize Conf, which is around embedded development in Rust. I've run a number of meetups, the Vagrant user group and the Elasticsearch user group in Berlin, which was the first Elasticsearch user group on this planet and the first Vagrant user group on this planet. I'm quite proud about that, and you see where the products went. And I founded Rust Berlin within the Open Tech School, which is a large free organization that does community education around all kinds of software topics. So I'm involved in a number of community organizations, and that's the focus of this talk. Ruby Berlin, which is a foundation for running a number of conferences around here in Europe, around the topic of Ruby. The Open Tech School, which is this Berlin-based organization for running meetups. It has had over 1,000 meetups in the last 5 years with around 50 to 60 organizers running them, and I'm part of the Rust project. In summary, those are teams with around 400 people and an audience of around 100,000 people. And I give this talk in none of my capacities. It's purely my personal opinion, so I don't speak for those communities. It's my personal reading. The other thing is, I think any community that can actually be called as such, that wants to be interacted with, and this is where it gets interesting to you, will form formal or informal organizations. Particularly interesting thing about the Rust project is there is no foundation or something like that. We are a project, we produce software, but you cannot actually address anyone as the legal body of Rust. This may or may not change in the future, but that is the current state. And yeah, I'm doing community management for this language, this artifact in this world, as a hobby, whatever that means. Programming languages are an interesting experience point to think about. They have obvious value, they're fundamental. We cannot program without programming languages. They have the habit of forming communities. People identify as I'm a Rubyist, I'm a Rustacean, or I'm both. But they are rather far from business value. Probably changing a little bit of CSS, making the button work better, gives you a lot more business value than changing your programming language, or flaws in a programming language can be easier worked around than fundamental flaws in your product design. So they are an interesting case in our industry. And companies value communities nowadays. At least they say so, but I would like to question that. Do they? And first of all, I share a little bit of experience. So when I started RustFest, I basically built upon my previous ties, and I was approaching a notable sponsor. I was like, hey, we worked together at Eurocamp 2012 to 2015, and we always had a productive relationship. We were quite active around that. I'm starting a new conference around the programming language Rust, and you are a company that is always interested in trying out new stuff and being involved in open communities. So voila. The response baffled me because it was, I'm not aware of any previous interactions and I am not aware of our interaction with YouCam. I would have been okay with a no, but what, you don't know me? Turns out they had 0 internal tracking, and this is a major player in the space. And the problem was all my contacts had left. It was handed over. There was no internal way to actually figure out if that dealing had happened except going through the invoices. So you value communities, but you actually don't write down what they had interacted with them? So the first issues I want to talk about are issues of neglect. Wanting to engage with communities and saying so, but actually not spending the appropriate time to think about how do we interact with who do we interact, do we have ties, did it go positive, did it go negative, to avoid future negative interactions. I'm not saying that you that you always should be supportive. A lot of organizations actually have no map of the community internally. Often, community knowledge is not institutional. It is actually held by the people that are having these kinds of conversation on the fringes, and that does not make them continuous or sustainable. And that's becoming more and more of a problem with projects growing larger and larger. Second, confusing community with body business. It's pretty often, especially because DevRel interactions are very, very often personal. A lot of people approach me at this conference, we have chat, whatever, but there's often no step off this. Where does the moment start where we actually don't want to interact Florian to Flaki, but actually start doing projects together where there's buy-in from either of our organizations in both sides. And third, a non-sophisticated community model. A game I play with all the blog posts that you write is replacing every word of community with users or customers. Works most of the time with no information lost. If that's happening, you have no community model. You have a good model of what your users and your customers are, but call them users, call them customers, that's fine. So the fix for that is get more fine-grained, and being fine-grained is incredibly hard there. From my time in the Ruby community, I know of at least 20 Ruby sub-communities that have different technical ways of building things. Some of them might be fringe and completely uninteresting to you as a company. It's okay to not engage with them. It's cool to be aware of them. Or maybe they're interesting for hiring, but absolutely have no other business value. And I know of at least 10 different Rust sub-communities that you need to interact differently with or that are working subtly different. Step up, issues of alignment. First of all, not knowing the structure. I'm now frequently in London. I don't know how to move in London. Particularly, I don't know how to move in rush hour in the subway. There's particularly the move set that you need to pressure into and out without getting people annoyed. I'm a foreigner, that's fine. If I were to live in London, this is a skill I need to learn. If I want to engage with a community that's outside of my company, I need to learn that. How do I make sure that my company learns that? How do my institution that I'm representing to make sure that not only I don't do any missteps, but everyone else? Second problem, nothing to bring. Lack of mandate and improper tools. Inability to do anything outside of the direct sales funnel or outside of your normal language. I've recently gotten a request to one of my larger projects. It was, hey, could we chat about a substantial piece of work that would have involved free work on our side, especially we have lots of time constraints. Asking open source projects to do 1 hour of work is substantial per month, not like one-off. And the email ended with, we might be able to send you a couple of stickers. Cool. We just skip that line. Maybe it would have been better without it. But that points to, you don't actually have a mandate from internally where you can bring something to an organization of more than 10 people, because suddenly you need to bring something for an interaction. Issue number 6, community as a discriminator. Using the term community to put an unsharp boundary between you and the outside. It is totally okay to not call everything a community. Use specific terms. A good example here is Community Edition versus Enterprise Edition. This example, because that term became kind of an accepted term, it's fine to use it, still points to an interesting mindset that part of your software is for the community, the rest is for the payers. How does that map well? I have no connection to the community term here. And the third one, and this is where it's getting nasty, is a lot of opportunism in communication. And all of these examples I picked from orgs that take great care about communication. They dot all I's, they cross all T's, and I'm surprised how these faults happened. So one of the main issues, using community as a shield. So using the term community, uncalled for, no one has asked for this, in an inclusive fashion, but to actually deflect. Elastic versus AWS. AWS has recently forked Elasticsearch, and their blog post was very down to the details on why they did it. Particularly, Elastic licensing is problematic and poorly managed, particularly making commits on their project with different licensing in one commit. We fork. Elastic's response was, we need to protect our community from fracturing. This blog post actually has the term community 8 times. My emotional engagement with a 100 million funded startup, as nice as they may be, in AWS, catching in the mud is 0. This is not a community issue. Trying to make it one is a problem. Community by your definition, using the unsharpness of the community boundary for effect at will. Also Elastic. They're currently suing a competitor. We believe that all SearchGuard users are part of the Elastic community in an update on the current state of their legal proceedings. Interesting. I haven't, as someone who has formed one of their user groups, I haven't asked for where you place me, especially with the offer that I can buy their services to be free of sin. Just remove that sentence, maybe? And the other one, that's a pretty classic one, good weather open communication. Open communication is practiced until there's issues. This is such a nice picture. This is Nat Friedman in a dome. It's all transparent. They're a transparent company, covered in ice. Current GitHub's communication is vastly in opposition to them last year having the market trying to be more open, talking more openly. Actually, their open conversation is completely one-sided, and it currently shows because they're shutting it down one-sided. If you want to be part in the community, if the community asks questions, you need to answer. It's okay to not do so, but then don't say that you are part of any kind of community conversation. Why am I picking the ICE example? We're actually practically impacted. The Rust project is very directly impacted by those policies. We cannot run any project meetings in the US because we have a number of community members that cannot cross the border, and we have a substantial Mexican community. So we are pretty close to all those issues as a project. And if we care about that, we need to care about those issues. Interesting here is the last 3 issues are examples of CEOs overriding the rest of the communication of the company. And this is where we get back to you. I'm going to make a blunt statement here. Your company probably has no community inherently. There's no community around your company. There's communities around your company. Some more natural, some not. I'm in the Spotify room. Spotify has a natural connection to artists' communities. But it's not like they're forming an artist community by themselves in some ways, in some not. Some companies do form communities, but it's actually more edge than you think, more of an edge case than you think. Because communities are fundamentally misaligned with your goals. Many open communities are interested in having multiple players around, which is fundamentally different from your goal of taking over the world. Community interaction in practice is often just individuals with work and free time. The amount of requests that I get from DevRel people that are like, hey, let's do something, but actually this is more of a hobby project, and I'm doing that on the side, and maybe I get some free time in my work. There's actually no buy-in from the company that I work for, I just like you. That's fine, that can be made work, but then that's not your company investing, or that's not your developer relationship investing as an extension of your organization. And there's a lot of willful blurring of terms like users, customers, and community. And I don't like this. Call your users users, your customers customers, and the communities you interact with communities. Companies are from Mars, community projects are from Venus. And that's fine. The problem isn't DevRels. The problem is often my experience is that people that I interact with are structurally set up in that they can bring me nothing, but they're sent from higher up. So like, please do you contact them over there because the Rust project, for example, has good marketing. People want to tap into that. But the good part, you can. You are part of communities, and you can participate. Your company can participate if they buy in, but that's not like your individual action, at least not externally first. It's internally first. Communities have less clearly defined goals. You can, for example, use communities to further your goals if they happen to be aligning. Communities are a meeting spot, and that's good. They're kind of neutral ground. If you appreciate them as neutral ground, that works really, really well. And your community standing is a nebulous business value, and it's incredibly nebulous. And we've seen a lot of talks here, actually, about a lot of these subjects. C-level buy-in, there was a talk yesterday. There was a talk about the orbit model of like trying to move away from the funnel at least when modeling relationships around you, figuring out if you have people that are really not a sales target, but are interested, are actually talking positively about you. And all these interactions are often handled by DevRel teams, and there's a fork there. Either more power to the DevRels, which I would actually enjoy, because personally speaking, it's one of the communities where I have the best interactions. Structurally speaking, it's one of the communities I have the worst. Because my engagements have grown so much that individual interactions need to have a substantial amount of organizational interaction on the side if it ends up being something of value for my projects and not for me as a person. Why should you care? There's an evolution in developer communities. They're much more organized. The Webpack project, and I had to update that number, I had to double it. And this talk was initially given at a meetup just a couple of months ago, has $500,000 of yearly funding. That's a substantial operation. The Rust project has 220 people who works in a company that has 220 people. This room. What, see? Has its own marketing, community, and support department. We have 50,000 followers on Twitter, 20,000 on YouTube, which is bigger than most industry competitors. 50,000 followers on Twitter, that's Apple Swift as a programming language Twitter account, just as a relationship. And we're extremely careful around our reputation. We are in a position where we can't say no, but because we're also a community project, we feel bound to actually saying yes to people that forward our cause, that get engaged, that, for example, run meetups, give talks, or whatever. So access to this YouTube account is actually super simple if you have someone who can give competent Rust talks, and I totally don't care if your company logo is on it. And I'm going to do that work for free. That's a really, really cheap shot. But community projects also run into huge sustainability issues because of that. They're getting much more self-conscious around this. You've seen yesterday's keynote. The extension of this is we're entering a time where free software will not be as free anymore. And people will fight for actually getting their worth out of it. And ethics are back on the table. There's no split between industry and commons anymore, in a good and in a bad way. The relationship between a company and an independent FOSS project has to be handled much more as a business-to-business or organization-to-organization relationship. Companies that want to interact with the FOSS project need to come with a substantial buy-in if that should be a relationship that holds. Otherwise, we just can't spend time on it. It's not even like we don't care. It's like we have to care about someone else. Organizational relationships, because of that, ideally have to be less bound to people. So if I'm leaving the Rust project, and we're 2019, I cannot take all my relationships with me. That's a substantial risk. So responsible people switching jobs, dropping all connections, not going to fly. Responsibilities within the company change. We want to be in touch with teams. And I've had an interesting conversation yesterday about, for example, a company that wanted to join a larger tech foundation. And they took the right step. They went to the tech department. We're like, OK, so who's going to sit on that foundation? And what is the cause that we want to represent on that foundation? And the tech department was like, oh, we just think we should give them money. That's not really a good relationship. That's the other side. You should be aware of what you want to get out of it. Good relationships mean you get something out of it. The habit of giving free software projects basically scrap money for just feeling good is bad for both sides. And this is the whole other talk about how open communities suck at getting money and arguing for their value. That I'm going to give at another conference. Yet, the people handling them and that are structurally sent out are often B2C marketers. In a lot of organizations, the misunderstanding around DevRel tends to be, and we've seen this complaint yesterday as well, especially in one of the keynotes, basically downgrading DevRel to marketing without money. But we need long-running relationships. But on the other hand, because we are, these things that I represent, or the projects I represent, are developer projects in that sense, we need people that actually understand what we're talking about. So on the other hand, that would be exactly the right department to put it into. And the question size is more and more often you will be a small player, but communities are your way to ride the wave and grow faster. Communities are multipliers, and they're much happier at multiplying you than your competitor. So you need to come up with more strategy around free and open source relationships. Does your company have a free and open source liaison with a budget? Intel, ARM, all the old enterprise companies actually have that. And can you speak in capacity of your company? Can you do a complex handoff and buy-in and do you have buy-in from your other teams? How do you support the developers of your programming language to use? It's pretty hard to fund a compiler developer because of the problem that the value that a compiler developer brings to your organization is pretty fringe. It gives a lot of value to everyone, but arguing why me, and I have this discussion internally basically by myself having a company, why should I pay the bill and not someone else? And also put us in your CRM, please. A couple of positive examples. All from the Rust community, because that's where I'm currently in. Embark Studios. It's a new game studio in Stockholm. Most people in the Rust community are actually not that game affiliated, but they've got a name by contributing to Rust both financially along their needs, by funding, for example, library development that goes towards something that they need for their software, and giving it tons of careful feedback. Even just spending an hour giving proper feedback to a project, just avoiding that we need to figure out where we need to go, that's a substantial contribution that you can do as a small organization that will give you a lot of credit. Make an effort and make that like every quarter of a year, spend half a day thinking about what do we need from this community and how can we give feedback, actionable feedback. Mozilla, other way around, has an international community that is actually global and not just US and Europe, and allows you to tap into it. So one of the things that we have written very hard in the Rust project is tapping into the Mozilla community to be able to use them as a multiplier. You can do that if you have if you actually have a substantial number of ties, make them available. And Mozilla does not run you over for commercial interest. Microsoft, and that's quite odd. Like, obviously had an axe to grind with GitHub's communication, and Microsoft, being the owner of GitHub, has done a lot of communication around separating themselves from GitHub. So in our community, GitHub has a very, very nice, Microsoft has a very, very nice name, especially because they have tons of frictionless procedures. They're used to a lot of small interactions regularly, and the DevRel people actually have leverage and are great at internal hands-off. They know the internals of their company. Hey, you want to talk to this one? They know about this. They can spend half an hour on talking to you about that issue so that you don't have to understand how Windows works for 3 days. And they're incredibly flexible. So, final slide. As a word of encouragement, I'm not asking you to fix the world, just a tiny bit of it. Pick one of your strong suits. You don't need to build a skill to contribute to the community, but if you have one, figure out what can you bring to that. Your competitors overestimate the community size currently. Realism gives you traction. And communities usually have people that want to see you succeed. So especially around that, I'm not quite aware how things work around here. If you're open about that, there's always someone who's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to explain it to you. That person does this, that person does that. They are a bit ranty and whatever. Don't feel pressured. Engage for your organizational gain. And then document those gains in context internally, because that makes the relationship sustainable. Because if you can't argue internally why that should hold, except your love for something, that will break immediately when you leave. Thank you.